Welcome. Today we're going to be taking apart an Asus Zenbook UX580G. And to start, we're going to need a small Torx bit. I believe this is a T5. And then once we get inside the laptop, it's just a small Phillips bit. You might need a couple sizes. We'll find out. And we are going to be leaving the LCD as one piece. We are not going to be taking apart the LCD. It's held pretty tight together with glue, and it's like a slimline LCD, so they're very, very hard to take apart and replace just the LCD. So that is why we leave them whole. So the first thing we're going to do is flip it over and remove all of these Torx head bits on the bottom case. Alright, once we have those screws removed, we can go ahead and pop the bottom case off. So the easiest way I've found is just to get your fingernails underneath the bottom case in the back, and then just kind of pop it up and off. Alright, so look inside. We have pretty easy access to the battery, SSD, fan, and heatsink assembly, and Wi-Fi card, so that's good. Looks like a pretty decently easy laptop to work on. So the first thing we're going to do is remove the looks like the battery is underneath the speakers. So in this case, we'll go ahead and pull the speakers, and then we can go ahead and remove the battery. Generally, if you're just going to upgrade your SSD or do your fan, it's not always really that vital to disconnect the battery, but best practice, especially if you're just going to disassemble the whole thing, we try to do that first, just to de-energize the circuits of the laptop. But as long as you're really, really careful and you don't short your bit across any of the terminals or the little solder points on the board, you should be fine. But you just have to have that extra measure of being careful. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove the battery screws as well, just as the course of it needing to be done. But we're definitely going to have to remove these speakers before we can remove the battery, because you can see the speaker cable is routed through the little channels in the battery. So we'll just lift up the speaker and kind of weave it out of the little catches here, and to disconnect from the motherboard, simply just push straight out on that connector using the little tabs on either side. Alright, so we'll just leave those out of the case for now. So I want to get a little wiggle room with this battery. And it's got a couple tabs at the bottom. This type of connector, it pops up and off, but it's easier to do if you can tilt the battery. But they seem to make that really hard to do. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we'll just grab the battery from below and lift up, and then you'll be able to remove it from the connector. Alright, so we got the battery out. This particular motherboard is a bad unit, and I believe it's from spill damage, because removing that connector, it was actually like partially glued in there with some sticky stuff. So I think they spilled some soda or something on their laptop. But definitely do not spill anything on your keyboard, because it's just going to run. It'll usually just run straight through and then short out the motherboard. Okay, so taking a quick look here, we'll do the Wi-Fi card next, which is just a matter of pulling those antennas off and removing the screw. Just pull it straight out of the slot. Alright, flip it around to the SSD and just poke the screwdriver through a little sticker there, or you can peel the sticker off. And then once you have that removed, you can pull the SSD out of the slot. And this is a SATA M2 SSD. So that's the interface type right there that you'll need to, if you want to upgrade or replace your SSD. So interestingly enough, I'm not sure with this configuration because the bottom case has been off, and that looks like an NVMe slot to me. So I would double check and just see if this particular model came with an NVMe or a SATA M2, because a lot of times people will, stick in a drive that's not there originally, and this laptop had been obviously taken apart before, so double check on that SSD. But it looks to me like an NVMe slot, but maybe it is a SATA M2. All right, so we can go ahead and start clearing the way for the fans and heatsink to come off. So it looks like the fans come off independently. We'll find out. And for the fan connector, if you can get your fingernail in there, all the better. You might need a tool, or you can just disconnect and possibly lift the fan up before you have to pull that connector off. Trying to see if they allow you. Okay, so you can actually wiggle the fan out from underneath the heatsink, so you can definitely replace the fans independent of the heatsink if you need to. You don't really need to remove it. You just have to kind of push it up a little bit to slide the fan out from underneath it. So that's good if you don't want to mess with thermal paste. Alright, so we'll flip around to the other side and we'll do the same thing. We'll remove the fan connector. And we'll remove the screws. So it looks like the heatsink is just attached actually on the GPU. They don't have any screws on either side there. This one feels like it has foam or something on the bottom side, so I'm not going to really press the issue until we remove the heatsink. Just kind of slide that back into place. I'll go ahead and remove the other cables here that are overlapping the heatsink. So this type of connector, you just remove the screws and then pop it straight up and off. And for the two smaller ribbons, they have an outer retainer. So you just flip up on that little dark colored bar, and then once you remove the ribbons, flip it back down. And then just gently and carefully peel back the adhesive here that the cables are kind of stuck to, just like that. Alright, so now that we have that out of the way, we can go ahead and remove or loosen these heatsink screws, and these come out. Oftentimes these are retained in the back and you can't remove them, you just loosen them. Alright, so now we can just wiggle that heatsink free from the GPU and CPU. A lot of times the thermal paste, especially if it gets older, can act as a pretty strong adhesive. So just make sure you have all the screws removed. And then you can unstick it and remove it from the motherboard. So it was just the foam that was kind of catching on the edge of this plastic here. So if you need to remove this fan, just pull a little bit harder. I wasn't sure what was holding it, so I didn't want to yank on it. But it's just this layer of foam here kind of drags and hits the top of the keyboard plastic. Alright, so we'll give it a last look, and now we can go ahead and remove the rest of the ribbons and cables that are connected to the motherboard. So I see most of these are just the flip up type. So you'll flip up that retainer. Sometimes it's on the ribbon side, sometimes it's on the back side, but they work exactly the same. And it's always a good idea to flip it back down so that it doesn't get broken. Tiny one. And a few more on this side. Okay, so I think we got all of the ribbons that are connected to the motherboard, and now we'll go ahead and remove the screws. Alright, so once we have the screws removed and all of the ribbons disconnected, we can go ahead and just start wiggling on the motherboard and making sure it feels nice and loose. And then you may have to pull the USB ports free of the little holes in the palm rest to be able to remove it on either side. And then we're going to gently flip it over and make sure there's nothing plugged into the back side. Alright, so this one has, it's got RAM on board, so definitely not upgradable as far as your RAM or anything else as far as the GPU. So that is how you remove the motherboard. Alright, so we'll take a look at the palm rest assembly. We're gonna leave it as a complete assembly, but I'll take a peek underneath the backing plastic here and we'll see if the keyboard is replaceable. So you might not be able to see that on the camera, but the keyboard is just held in place by melted plastic rivets. It's lighter and cheaper to manufacture than using a whole bunch of screws, but it usually means you need to replace your palm rest and keyboard as an assembly. So just keep that in mind, that the keyboard is not replaceable. But it looks like the touchpad is. It looks like there's just one further Phillips screw that needs to come out to remove that touchpad. So that is pretty much it for the palm rest assembly, and now we can go ahead and remove those screws for the display assembly and separate that from the palm rest. So looking in the back here, there's a little bridge of tape that goes over those display cables, so you definitely want to feed that out before you remove the hinges, because it'll keep you from pulling those ribbons through. So it looks like we're in good shape there to remove those hinge screws and remove the rest of the display assembly. So if you're just replacing your screen and you don't want to go through all this, just make sure that you have these 3 ribbons disconnected from the motherboard, and that you have access to those 8 hinge screws. So as long as those 2 conditions are met, you should be able to separate the display assembly from the palm rest without having to take all the other stuff apart. So now that we're ready to separate the 2, I'm going to go ahead and just remove 2 screws from each side. I want 2 screws in each side to remain for when I open up the assembly, because we're going to need it in a fully open position to separate the 2 halves after we've removed all the screws. So just like that, and we'll go ahead and open it up. And during the removal of the last 4, you want to support the assembly either with your hand or something that is tall enough underneath to kind of keep the weight off of the last screws before you remove them. Okay, we have the screws removed, and now we can separate that display assembly from the palm rest. And that is pretty much it for the palm rest assembly. You do have access to the fingerprint reader, which is attached by some glue, it looks like. But otherwise, just the LED board, I believe that is, or yeah. LED board is accessible if you want to replace that. But definitely not the keyboard, and the Wi-Fi antennas, looks like they're just kind of clipped in there. I don't see any screws to remove. And like I said earlier, the slimline displays can be really tricky to separate without breaking. So that's why we leave these in a whole unit, and it would definitely make life easier if you're replacing your whole screen as an assembly rather than trying to take it apart. It's just, they don't make it easy anymore, especially with the slimline laptops. So that is how you disassemble a Asus Zenbook UX580G. And if you found this informative or you liked the video, please like and subscribe. Thank you.